Well, it's customary that as they begin each new book of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, we begin it with an introduction so that we have a sense of what to expect. And as we're entering the second book now of Samuel, we're going to have that introduction, and we're even going to get into the first chapter a little bit tonight. However, the introduction is going to be of a little bit different flavor than usual. We are going to necessarily get very historical. Now, because the Bible focuses so intensely on Israel, the Hebrew people, their land inheritance of Canaan, we can get a little bit of tunnel vision, and we lose sight that there was much of significance occurring in the nations surrounding Israel that was going to at some point have a profound impact upon Israel's future. Only a meager bit of information concerning these nations outside of the Holy Lands are reported in the scriptures. And this is at least partially because the writers of the biblical books were Hebrews, and they were primarily concerned with what immediately affected them. Now, a rather isolated focus on our own nation and culture is typical for most of us. In the modern era, it was probably World War II when the average American began to acknowledge that there was a world out there beyond our borders. For several decades, we didn't see how what was going on elsewhere in places like Europe and Asia was bound to eventually affect us. In our day, the issue has shifted so far towards an integration and an interweaving of international affairs with American society that a great debate is underway about a steady erosion of our sovereignty and our culture and our national identity that seems to be hurtling us at light speed towards a single unified world government, perhaps a world monetary system. One side of the debate finds such a global government, a societal integration that virtually dissolves borders, that ends nationalism as healthy and desirable, if not inevitable. The other side sees it as aberrant, of the devil, and it's the prophetic means of ushering in that great world leader and deceiver that Christianity calls the Antichrist. Now, ancient Israel's leaders and citizenry, soon after David's time, would, like modern America, face the same philosophical, geopolitical dilemma with strong opinions on both sides of the matter. This wide divergence of desires among the Israelites ignited passions that quickly led to civil war and the splitting of Israel into two separately governed kingdoms almost immediately following King Solomon's death. But the set of circumstances that caused this dissolution of God's earthly kingdom didn't develop overnight. It didn't happen in a vacuum. The Lord was invisibly and undetected operating behind the scenes of human government, as only his unstoppable providential will can. And that was in order to bring about a long-term plan that, while centering on Israel, would also eventually incorporate the entire planet. Thus, many nations outside of Israel would become unwitting players in Jehovah's plan. Well, we are all at least somewhat aware of the Assyrian and the Babylonian empires that would conquer parts of Israel and drive the Israelites into exile in a number of stages. But even in David's time, Egypt was reemerging from its dark ages. And there were also other serious players beginning to appear on the world stage that consisted, as of this time, of primarily the Middle East and Northern Africa. And they would, in one way or another, play a role in redemption history. So let's take a little time to see what was going on in the nations surrounding Israel at the same time that David was well on his way to becoming Israel's king, because David would have been quite aware of these circumstances, and this would have played a significant role in many decisions that we see him make. that are recorded in 2 Samuel. Now let's approach this by dividing the known world up into 5 main geographical regions: Mesopotamia, Egypt, North Syria, the Phoenician coast, and Canaan. Now, certainly this is not an exhaustive list. Other regions were known and they could be defined, but these 5 had the most direct effect upon Israel and upon biblical matters. So we're going to stick with them. Now, the Israelites always had a sense of attachment to Mesopotamia because that's where the founder of their race, Abraham, came from. And after migrating to Canaan at God's leading and establishing the covenant of promise with Jehovah, upon which all future covenants would depend, Abraham sent his servant back up to Mesopotamia to find a wife for his son Isaac. And then later, Isaac's son Jacob fled up to Mesopotamia to escape the wrath of his twin brother, and there he found his wife and started a family before moving them all back to Canaan. Now, in reality, Mesopotamia also represents a distant attachment to virtually all the world's races and tribes because the ark that carried the few remnants of humanity through the Great Flood came to rest on Mount Ararat in Mesopotamia. Thus, all who are alive today, you, me, everybody on this planet, we can count Mesopotamia as our earliest homeland and even representative of our earliest common culture and language, dating back to when the earth was purged of its wickedness by Jehovah. Now, during David's time, up in Mesopotamia, the nation of Assyria was already in existence. They were in a struggle for sovereignty, if not outright existence, with the powerful Arameans. Now, Babylonia also existed at this time, and Assyria hoped to demonstrate through its fierce resistance to these Arameans that Babylonia was an easier target for them, and it succeeded to some degree. Even so, the Arameans gained a foothold, and they established some settlements along the eastern side of the Tigris River. And they also overran some Assyrian territory, and they settled along the Euphrates River. We have unearthed extensive records on this long ongoing conflict between the Arameans and the Assyrians, and thus we find that all during the 10th and 11th centuries BC, this was Samuel's and Saul's and David's time, that this conflict was as central to the Assyrians' way of life as was the conflict that seemed to be never ending between Israel and the Philistines. The issue dominated the attention of the governmental leadership, as one might expect, to the exclusion of almost everything else. And naturally, this long-term war had a great deal to do with setting national policy, setting national priorities. Now, let me set that statement in context so you can perhaps see what I'm getting at. Since September 11th, 2001, American history has largely been defined by the fight against primarily Islamic enemies. Conflicts with Iraq, Afghanistan, continuing brinksmanship with Iran, and the militaristic North Korea even. This conflict has spilled over into serious border security issues between the USA and Mexico, and it vacillates between stopping the infiltration of terrorists, fighting the drug trade, protecting America's national economic security. It's even affected America's relationship with modern Israel, because their very existence is an intolerable irritant to those with whom the USA would rather be friends, but who could also quickly become enemies. The realities of this war with Islamic nations and their desire to reassert Muslim dominance around the world has defined so much of our lives for the first and second decades of this new millennium. Because of this new reality, a powerful new federal agency called Homeland Security was created. It was given broad powers to penetrate our privacy for what's seen as the national good. We have millions upon millions of closed-circuit TV cameras across our nations, even more so in Europe, with thousands more added every day, and they record our every movement. Immense chains of computers listen into our phone conversations, read our emails, all of them attuned to catch words like bomb, jihad, assassination. We have our shoes x-rayed. We have our toothpaste confiscated. We wait in interminably long lines before we can board a commercial jet. Now, I don't say any of this truly with condemnation or judgment or even political overtones. I say it to explain that although we at times stop noticing it, every era of history has a feature that dominates and dictates our decisions and our direction, and this is especially so for all national leadership. To ignore this reality is to entirely miss the underlying reasons that history takes the course it does, and it is very much the same with biblical history as well. So in David's era, because Assyria had to fight off the Arameans for at least a century, each side was forced into putting the bulk of their national resources into developing a large and an able military. But a military, you see, can be used for more than national defense. It can be used to subjugate. It can be used to control a nation's own citizens. Or it can be used and deployed to conquer its neighbors. It can be used to build an empire. It's rare in history that a military is built up and not used, or then used involuntarily decommissioned. So any governmental world leader in David's day was acutely aware that while Assyria and the Arameans were currently preoccupied with this long conflict against one another, it could end at any moment. And when it ended, there was clear danger that the winner would want to flex their muscles. That they'd want to seek to use this highly developed military capability to enlarge their territory. So as David was assuming the throne in Israel, the picture up in Mesopotamia was one of the Arameans exerting pressure on both Assyria and Babylonia. And so these three advanced Mesopotamian nations had built up substantial, experienced militaries, and each nation had developed an aggressive culture of war and a national policy that revolved around war. In the region of North Syria, the Arameans were the unquestioned dominant force. They established large areas where the various Aramean tribes grew into substantial populations. They exported their Aramean culture and their gods into the other tribes of that region. Now, in reality, the Arameans probably held a position somewhat like that of the American Indians when the Pilgrims first landed on North American soil. In other words, similar to American Indians, the Arameans were viewed as the original and thus the natural tribal landholders of that region. So from their perspective, their wars were merely about trying to hold on to what had always been theirs, their ancient land heritage. In doing so, they undoubtedly absorbed large numbers of survivors of the many tribal clashes that characterized that area in the 12th and 13th centuries BCs, but also without doubt, the Arameans were the overriding culture in the North Syria region, and the good fortune of highly improved climate conditions during the 10th century BC, as compared to 2 or 3 centuries before that time, led to their ability to sustain a robust and a growing population. It has always been, and remains so, that the growth of any people group is directly proportional to their ability to grow food. It was that way for America as well. This is why the Bible makes such an issue of explaining that during Israel's entry into the promised land, it was a land flowing with milk and honey. In other words, the combination of terrain and soil conditions and climate, all of which was to be credited to the God of Israel, allowed for abundant food production, which in turn allowed for a population explosion of Israelites. This was not necessarily so for the earlier inhabitants of Canaan, nor was it necessarily so for other regions of Asia, the Middle East, the Far East, Northern Africa. Thus, various nations grew or declined in population and power, usually with the chief factor being the ability to feed their people. It had happened that same way for the Hebrews down in Egypt, when unwittingly the Pharaoh of Egypt allowed Joseph to put Jacob's family of refugees into the fertile delta region of Egypt, just at a time in history when climate conditions changed and they improved. In a place of naturally fertile soil, the Israelites increased from a population of around 200 when they entered Egypt to around 3 million when they departed 4 centuries later. It is interesting that Assyrian records indicate that same improved climate phenomenon was occurring up in Mesopotamia, in that very region that was held largely by the Assyrians. In fact, the notable kings of that era, several of which are recorded in the Bible, made it a point to mention that their ability to finally prevail against the Arameans had much connection to their ability to grow more food and to thus feed and increase their population. Population and economic power have always gone hand in hand. It was the larger nations that conquered the smaller nations for the purpose of growing their nation even further. Even in modern times, the folly of zero population growth has come home to roost in Japan and in Europe, as they suddenly realized that it is population growth that fuels economies. And so, because these nations had convinced their societies to stop having children, their economies have floundered. And their people have been so well trained that the idea of having perhaps even one child has all but vanished. And now these nations are faced with having to import population growth by means of opening their doors to more immigration, all except Japan, that is. Let's look at Egypt to see what losing population means to a nation. Egypt was devastated by the loss of the Israelites in the Exodus because it produced their economic collapse. The Bible doesn't do justice to the underlying reason why the Pharaoh so stubbornly refused, from an earthly political standpoint anyway, to let God's people go, despite all the havoc that the Lord was wreaking on Egypt. See, in Moses' day, the Hebrews formed easily 1/4 of Egypt's total population. The Hebrews represented the core of the nation's craftsmen, laborers, and builders. Their loss, virtually overnight, en masse meant that Egypt lost its ability to build roads, buildings, monuments, dwellings, on and on. Egyptian merchants suddenly had 25% fewer customers. Even their military suffered because now men who were well-trained warriors would have to put down their spears and take up shovels and hammers. Imagine if in a single 24-hour period, the USA's population declined from our current 300 million to 225 million. Imagine if the population that went away consisted of the working class: carpenters, plumbers, electricians, mechanics, truck drivers, bricklayers, highway workers, railroad engineers, dock workers, communication technicians, steel workers. Fill in the list. That's what happened to Egypt. And by the way, if Tim LaHaye's vision of the consequence of the rapture is correct, that's what's going to happen to the world in general in the very near future. Economic collapse invariably produces an agitated population, and that is usually accompanied by political upheaval. These circumstances at the time of the Exodus drove Egypt to become the equivalent of Russia at the end of the 20th century. A one-time superpower suddenly could barely feed their own citizens. They couldn't provide jobs. They couldn't fend off invaders. They couldn't sustain a military. They couldn't prop up civilian morale. Those who had the means to leave, meaning those with education and money, did. And that further eroded the nation's ability to survive, let alone prosper. Expansionary ideas of the national leaders had to be put on hold in favor of merely keeping the nation from disintegrating. That was Egypt at the time Joshua led the Israelites across the Jordan River. But now, back to the time of David. Some 350 years or so after the Exodus, Egypt had made a comeback. Pharaohs Merneptah and Ramesses III battled the Libyans, other northern African nations that allied themselves with Libya. Egypt prevailed. They captured many of the enemy. And as the Pharaoh of Jacob's day had done, they placed them in the delta region of Egypt, well away from the bulk of Egyptian population. Once again, the ability to grow food allowed that population of immigrants to increase rapidly. Only this time, Egypt assimilated these people rather than grow paranoid at their size, and then subjugated them as they did with the Hebrews. Thus, the captured Libyans and their allies became part of the Egyptian national fabric in the same way that migrant Italians and Chinese and Africans and Hispanics and others came to America as foreigners, but in time, most blended in and became Americans. During the time of David, the Pharaoh of Egypt allowed a very able man of Libyan descent to begin his rise up the ranks of the Egyptian military command structure. And by Solomon's time, this Libyan became a general. And he went on to assume the throne as Pharaoh of Egypt. His name was Shoshank, also called Shishak. And we find mention of him in the Bible in 1 Kings and in 2 Chronicles. By the time of the second book of Samuel that we're just beginning, Egypt was again a powerful nation, and it had expansion in mind. The first step was to reunite Upper and Lower Egypt into a single nation under a single government. And once that was accomplished, Egypt looked north to the area of Canaan to reestablish a presence that they had enjoyed for centuries before Jacob had ever ventured into Egypt to be reunited with his son Joseph. The first place that Shoshank looked was at Phoenicia, because they were traders and merchants and seafarers, and that could give Egypt a much wider market for their goods. At the same time, Shishak attempted many forays into Judah to try and establish some new forts as Egyptian outposts. He met with little success, at least during David's and Solomon's time. Now, the Phoenicians, they were generally peaceful. They had established good relations with any who just wanted access to trade. In some ways, they were like the Philistines, in that they weren't so interested in acquiring territory. They were interested in doing business. And since business in that era involved access and use of land and sea trade routes, then most of the Phoenician military action had to do with either acquiring or defending those trade routes in order that marauders and pirates didn't plunder them, and so that nations where those trade lanes traversed didn't exact exorbitant taxes and tolls that essentially took away all their profit. Egypt wanted a piece of the action. And so there was a great synergy by means of Egypt and Phoenicia establishing good diplomatic relations and cooperating on trade. In any case, for economic reasons, Phoenicia began expanding into the Mediterranean. First with the island of Cyprus. Then they began to move eastward into North Syria with the weakening of the Arameans. Sidon and Byblos were allies of Phoenicia, and together they extended their influence all the way to Greece. With Egypt's help, together they also dominated the North African coastal region on out into the Atlantic Ocean. The bottom line is, Egypt and Phoenicia were economic powerhouses, and they controlled the coastal ports that the Philistines would have liked at their own disposal, and that David and Solomon also coveted. Now back to Canaan. The Bible is still our best source for what was going on there. Very little is known about the Philistines except through the Bible. There's a few Egyptian records. There's minor mention of them in Phoenician records. We know that the Philistines were eventually subdued, but not eliminated, by David, and that their power waned. David was on the verge of consolidating his power in Canaan to a degree that that land had probably never known in all of its history. So, as we get ready to open the second book of Samuel tonight, this was the condition of the known world. And this is what would face David as he assumed the throne of Israel as God's anointed king. What we have is essentially a golden moment in history, when the regional powers, who could have been formidable foes against Israel, were instead busy elsewhere, establishing trade, building strategic power bases, creating alliances, coalescing the various political factions of their own nations into something more cohesive, and fighting their immediate neighbors. So Israel was more or less under the radar. They were left alone by these major foreign powers to establish themselves as a new nation. David's foe of any consequence was the Philistines. And after spending almost 2 years among them, he knew them pretty well. David knew their strengths, their vulnerabilities, their military tactics. He knew their kings, their military leaders, their weaponry. This was going to allow him to defeat the Philistines, and then to turn his attention to finally claiming all the territory that God had promised to Abraham and to Moses, and then to build up his nation. His son Solomon would then take over a relatively stable Israel, and then he would build it up into a wealthy and admired sovereign state. However, from beginning to end, the ancient history of Israel as a unified nation lasted less than 1 century. Open your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 1. 2 Samuel chapter 1. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 334. Second Samuel chapter 1. Shaul had died. David had been 2 days in Ziklag after returning from the slaughter of the Amalekites. And on the third day, there came a man from Saul's camp with his clothes torn, earth on his head. He approached David and fell to the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to him, "Where are you coming from?" "I escaped from the camp of Israel," he replied. "Well, tell me, please, how did things go?" asked David. "Well, the people have fled the battle," he answered, "and many of them are wounded or dead. Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead too." And David asked the young man who had told him this, "How do you know that Saul and Jonathan, his son, are dead?" And the young man who had told him said, "I happened to be on Mount Gilboa when I saw Saul leaning on his spear. The chariots and the cavalry were bearing down on him, and he looked behind him, and he saw me, and he called to me. And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered, 'I'm an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'I'm in agony, I'm going to die, but I'm still alive, so please stand next to me and kill me.' So I stood next to him and I killed him, because I was sure he was so badly wounded he couldn't live. I took the crown that was on his head, the bracelet on his arm, and have brought them here to my Lord." Then David took hold of his clothes, they tore them. Likewise, all the men who were with him, they wailed, they cried, they fasted until evening for Saul, for Jonathan his son, for Adonai's people, for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David said to the young man who had told him, "Where are you from?" He answered, "I'm the son of a resident foreigner, an Amalekite." And David asked him, "How is it you weren't afraid to raise your hand to destroy Adonai's anointed?" And David called one of his young men and said, "Go over to him, kill him." The man struck him down and he died. And David said to him, "Your blood's on your own head. Your own mouth convicted you when you said, 'I killed Adonai's anointed.'" And then David pronounced this lament over Saul and over Jonathan his son in order to teach the people of Judah not to underestimate archery. The lament has been written down in the book of Yashar. "Your glory, Israel, lies dead on your high places. How the heroes have fallen. Don't speak of it in Gath. Don't proclaim it in the streets of Ashkelon. Then the daughters of the Philistines won't rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised won't gloat. Mountains of Gilboa, may there be on you no dew, no rain, no fields with good crops. Because there the shields of the heroes were dishonored. The shield of Saul was no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the dead, from the flesh of heroes, the bow of Jonathan did not retreat, or the sword of Saul return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, loved and gracious while alive, were not separated even in death. They were swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep over Saul. He clothed you luxuriously in scarlet. He put gold jewelry on your clothing. Oh, how the heroes have fallen in the heat of battle. Jonathan killed on your high places. How I grieve for you, my brother Jonathan. You meant so much to me. Your love for me was deeper than the love of a woman. How the heroes have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. I think David's rise to power can generally be seen as occurring in three distinct stages. First is his time in King Saul's inner court as the king's musician, his loyal armor bearer and friend to Saul's son, Jonathan. The second stage is David becoming Saul's enemy due to Saul's paranoia that stems from God abandoning the king. And then we see David's flight from the king with Jonathan's help, his forming a mercenary army of 600 disaffected Israelites, and then this long period of wandering and hiding to avoid Saul's murderous intentions. These first two stages take place in the last half of the book of 1 Samuel. The third stage is David's coronation as king over Judah, that southern portion of Canaan, and then his consolidation of power as he also becomes king over the northern portion of Canaan, the part that was the most loyal to King Saul. This occurs in the first few chapters of 2 Samuel. So verse 1 opens with, after the death of Saul. Now the Bible often uses the death of leaders and prominent characters to mark the end of one era and the beginning of another era. The first words of the book of Joshua are after the death of Moses. The first words of the book of Judges are after the death of Joshua. Thus, we see why if one's going to divide the long Samuel scroll into two, this is probably the logical place. So the essence of these few words is that at a critical page of redemption history, it has turned. The era of Saul is over. The era of David has begun. It's only Saul's death that makes David free to now turn away from his 2-year alliance with King Achish of the Philistines and turn back to reestablishing his connection first with his own tribe, Judah, and then next with Saul's kingdom. It was the third day after David and his men had returned to their devastated village of Ziklag. A bittersweet return it was, because happily they had retrieved every last person that the Amalekites had kidnapped, wives, children, the elderly, recovered all the goods and food that had been taken, and even came home with a sizable amount of loot that they had taken from the Amalekites that they had also killed in battle in order to free their families. However, their homes now lay in ruins. David and his men had been barred from participating with his hosts, the Philistines, in battle because the Philistine lords didn't trust David. So, he and his men were caught in this political no man's land. As far as David knew, Saul was still in charge of Israel and still determined to kill him. Where was home going to be? Even more, David and his men were in ever-increasing anxiety over what had happened to their brethren in Israel at the hands of these Philistines. It seemed inevitable that the Philistines would be victorious in this next great battle, but to what extent? And at the moment, they had no idea of the outcome. One can only imagine the sick feeling in the pit of David's stomach as this messenger approaches him, breathless, clothing torn, dirt caked in his hair. Because all of these are typical and customary signs of mourning for a Hebrew, for many Middle Eastern cultures. And this unnamed man, he falls down at David's feet. He prostrates himself with respect, and David now begins to question him. Where does he come from? From the battle camp of Israel, the man reports. What was the outcome of the battle, asked David. Disaster, says the man. The Amim, God's people, have fled before the Philistines. Then the worst possible news for David. Jonathan and King Saul are dead. David, of course, knows. He knows. Soldiers often mix fact with scuttlebutt. So he asks this messenger, how does he know for sure that Saul and Jonathan are dead? And the man goes on to explain he'd seen it with his own eyes. He says that the battle raged on, and suddenly he found himself on Mount Gilboa, and there was the king of Israel, badly wounded, leaning on a spear. Philistine chariots were swirling all around them. The Israelites had been overrun now by the cavalry. Saul called to this young soldier, and he asked him who he was, and he responds, he's the son of an Amalekite foreigner who settled in Israel. And the king explained that he was in agony, he was going to die, so he wanted this Amalekite lad to kill him. And he did. And so the young Amalekite took Saul's crown and his bracelet and immediately ran, here he says, to present them to David with this report. Like they say, some days it doesn't pay to get out of bed. Even after one has some time to think about this fellow's story, see that such thing is reported as highly improbable on a number of levels, this messenger was doomed the minute he presented himself to David. How could he have known, poor guy, that David had just finished dispatching the souls of around 1,000 Amalekites? And that this audience was taking place in what was left of David's village, thanks to this man's relatives. Ooh, that's not good. If ever there was a bad time to be an Amalekite, this was the moment, especially while bearing this kind of news. Well, David's emotions now are running high. You can see the blood boiling. And he seems to believe that this Amalekite was telling the truth, for the most part. And distraught, David and all of his men began to wail and cry and tear at their clothing in honest and deeply felt grief. They fasted, they mourned on behalf of Saul and Jonathan, and for this catastrophe that had befallen the house of Israel. The bulk of Israelite territory was now under the control of Gentiles. Then later, after several hours of mourning, David's grief, well, it turned to rage. He asked the same question of the young man that he says Saul had asked of him. Who are you? Where are you from? The young man testified it against himself again. He says he's the son of an Amalekite foreigner living among Israel. In Hebrew, this boy says he's an Amalekite ger. This is the key. A ger means a resident alien. This is a person who lives peacefully among the Israelites, but he hangs on to his own tribal identity. A ger does have some obligations, but he's not bound to Israel's covenants with God. A ger is not a foreigner who has come to Israel to become a citizen of Israel. He's a foreigner who wants to remain a foreigner. Yet a ger is bound enough that he is expected to know Israel's ways and to adhere to most of them. Why is that so important? Because that helps us to explain and to understand the significance of a crucial passage in the book of Ephesians that explains our relationship as believers to Israel. You don't have to turn there, but I'm going to read it to you. Ephesians 2:10-19. For we are of God's making, created in union with the Messiah Yeshua for a life of good actions, already prepared by God for us to do. Therefore, remember your formal state, you Gentiles by birth, called the uncircumcised by those who merely because of an operation on their flesh are called the circumcised. At that time, you had no Messiah. You were estranged from the national life of Israel. You were foreigners to the covenants, embodying God's promise. You were in this world without hope, without God. But now, you who were once far off have been brought near through the shedding of the Messiah's blood. For he himself is our shalom. He has made us both one and has broken down the wall, the miktsah, which divided us by destroying in his own body the enmity occasioned by the Torah, with its commandments set forth in the form of ordinances. He did this in order to create in union with himself from the two groups a single new humanity, and thus make shalom, and in order to reconcile to God both in a single body by being executed on a stake as a criminal, and thus in himself killing that enmity. Also, when he came, he announced as good news, shalom to you far off, Shalom to you nearby. News that through him we now both have access in one spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer foreigners or strangers. On the contrary, you are fellow citizens with God's people. Now you are members of God's family. The Amalekite was permitted to live among Israel as a foreigner, a Gentile stranger, but not as part of the family of God, not as a citizen along with God's people. Could he have become a citizen of Israel? Yes, if he'd wanted to. But apparently neither he nor his father wanted to be counted as an Israelite. Notice that he does not identify himself as an Israelite. How does he identify himself? An Amalekite. That's still his identity, as far as he's concerned. And as I explained in earlier lessons, all Gentiles are born with the spirit of Amalek. We are born as enemies of God and his kingdom. The only remedy for us is to accept God's mercy in the form of his son Yeshua. And when Gentiles by birth accept the Jewish Messiah by faith, we're no longer estranged from the national life of Israel. As verse 12 of Ephesians 2 says, you were foreigners. To what? We were foreigners, it says, to God's covenants. And with whom did God make those covenants? The Hebrews. A ger lives outside of Israel's covenants, even though he may live as a foreigner alongside Israel. But one who accepts Messiah Yeshua, says the book of Ephesians, now lives inside Israel's covenants as a fellow citizen, as a member now of God's family. Can you be a Christian and at the same time reject Israel's covenants? Over and over and over, the Old Testament and the New say, no, you can't do that. Because to accept Messiah is to accept Israel's covenants. They're one and the same. Outside of Israel's covenants, a Messiah has no meaning. Or as Paul would say in Romans 11, a Gentile is grafted into the covenants of Israel when we are saved by means of Christ. We'll continue this next week. Please rise.
Yeshua,